heavy.
Bored.
And this one has a nice introduction by William Carlos Williams. Again, because Ginsberg was the star. He was the star of 20th century poetry, and nobody's come close to it since. Not even close. But, I mean, I guess most of you probably know this. Most listeners that are listening to this podcast probably know this. But Howl, probably the most controversial book of poems that ever existed. And the reason for that is mainly because of, like, the Puritanism of the 50s in America. But still.
Well, and it was banned for a while, wasn't it?
Right. It was banned upon publication, and there's a nice little write-up in these books if you get this version. We link it in the description as always. But, yeah, basically City Lights was, all copies of the books were seized. City Lights was put on trial. They arrested the publisher and the bookstore manager. City Lights, I think, still exists. It's a bookstore in San Francisco.
Yeah.
That also put out books kind of around this time. And they were the big backers of, like, the beat poets at the time, or the beat writers at the time.
Well, that was Lawrence Ferlinghetti's store, right?
Yeah, he was the guy that ran the store in the press, and he was put on trial for it. And that's really the big thing about this, is, like, and maybe we should talk about that a little bit, like, kind of how much of this book's reputation is based around the idea that people found it obscene when it came out in 1956, to the point where, like, you know, the kind of, like, Puritan United States government at the time was saying that it was obscene and shouldn't be published.
Yeah, I mean...
Like, if this book came out and they didn't do that, would it have been the book that it is today?
Do we know?
I mean, it's
that
hard
it
to...
was
it's impossible to say, but...
yeah. I also... I mean, I do think it would have been a big deal. I think this... the poems are good, right? However, you know, we want to really talk about them. There's a lot that they do that is impressive. So, yeah, I think it would have been a big deal anyway. Maybe less so. But I think also that movement was already such a thing. You know, like, they were so... about being a movement, it feels like.
Oh yeah, that's literally all the beats were about. But I'll get to that too. You guys are listeners will finally hear my opinion on the beats. But yeah, and I guess most of the obscene stuff that they said was obscene was, like, the drug use and the gay stuff is essentially what the kind of Puritan 1950s, you know, right after McCarthyism stuff that happened in the United States. Listeners can look into that if you're unfamiliar with it. Like,
I mean, they also say cock and cunt a bunch.
Cock and cunt, and, you know, just the bad words, but really it's the drugs and the gay stuff that people were upset about. Because people were saying cock and cunt in all kinds of books, you know, before this. But, yeah, there was, like, some, you know, and you could try, I don't know. I mean, people probably have all kinds of theories as to what sparked this, but just reality was it was kind of much more puritanical. Some argue we're living through a similar circumstance now in terms of, like, Puritanism that's over everything. It's a little different, but the argument can be made. So it was really controversial, and this is sold, they said in the back of the book here, this is sold over 1 million copies. And those of you that follow this podcast like poetry or literature in general, like, for any book to sell 1 million copies, especially nowadays, let alone a poetry book, like a poetry, it's unheard of. Like, it does not happen. It will never happen ever again. Like, there are no poetry books that are going to be selling 1 million copies by a single author. Maybe some of these anthologies put together by what's his name, like Billy Collins or some bullshit, right? That might sell close to 1 million copies, but I doubt it even comes close. I bet there's like 150,000 copies of some of those, you know, poems for the everyday or whatever, that stupid series that Billy Collins edits. Like, nothing comes close. Like, this book sold more, and therefore this book is the most influential poetic work of the 20th century. And I include with the modernist, and that's, you know, coincides with the modernist stuff in the early part of the 20th century. Like, this is more influential than anything that came out of the modernist. At least that's my opinion.
So I pulled out my Norton that we actually both have. The Norton.
Dude, you know it's a good episode when Sophie's busting out the Norton.
Resources. American resources.
Being bored?
You know, some activities are intentional, right?
It shows such a lack of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.